My name's Irene. I'm Irene Pereira, one half of Anton and Irene. I'm the Irene there, obviously. And I'm a UX designer. And I have been a UX designer for almost 20 years. So the difference of art and design, to me, is very clear. And it actually comes from a quote by a very famous American minimalist artist who I adore. His name is Donald Judd. And Donald Judd very famously said, "Design has to work, art does not." And what he meant by that is that design always has a function, right? It always has a purpose. If you're designing a chair, you have to be able to sit on it. Or if you're designing a table, you have to be able to put something on it or use it as a dining table, right? It has to have a purpose and a function. Art doesn't need any of that. Art can just exist. And art can have a purpose, but it doesn't have to have a purpose, right? It can have a function, but it doesn't have to have a function. So I like that description, if you will, from Donald Judd the best that I've heard so far. So the differences between an art director and a creative director, it kind of depends on where you work. Because in some places, art directors behave like creative directors and creative directors behave like art directors. It really depends. But traditionally, the term art director actually comes from advertising. And so in advertising, an art director was responsible for the art, meaning that person usually also could illustrate because there were no computers yet, right? And so they had to be able to make those things by hand. And there was an art department. And a copy director would also be there. So that person would be responsible for writing the slogans, writing the copy that was on, on the ads. So you had the art director, art and copy working together for the creative director, who would be responsible for all creative in general. So because it's a very common term in advertising, and advertising predates any kind of digital world, right? We've kind of adopted those terms in the digital world. But an art director in digital is quite different because we don't have those kinds of clear definitions anymore of an art department with a copy department and a creative director. So art directors typically in a digital environment oversee other designers. Sometimes they set the direction of a project. Sometimes they do the creative direction of a project. But a creative director kind of sits above all of that because they typically are responsible for almost all the products or projects that come out of that studio. Whereas an art director can really focus typically, not always, but on one or two or three projects. And the creative director would have multiple art directors working for him and sets more of the relationships with the client, right? Sells the ideas, more of the organizational behind the scenes work that is required in order to get design made. And the art director typically doesn't have to worry so much about the politics of design. So I don't think designers need an education for a couple of reasons. So number one, because it's not a profession that requires a certification, right? So for example, if you are a therapist or a psychologist, you need to be held accountable in case you do something that is harmful to people, right? If you're a doctor, you want to make sure that that doctor understands, how to do whatever it is that they are specialized in, right? So we don't really have those kinds of markers for or certifications, if you will, for design, because design ultimately is not that important. So to have a degree in design uh, for the purpose of learning design is not really necessary. You can learn design on your own. You can watch tutorials. You can try stuff. It's very easy now to get any kind of software, so you can get started pretty much by yourself and do stuff. Right? You don't need a degree for that. And nobody will ever ask you for your degree either. I have never been asked for a degree. Anyone I've ever hired, I never ask for their degree. It's irrelevant because people care about your portfolio. So as long as you have a good portfolio, it doesn't really matter. Now, that doesn't mean that I don't recommend not going and studying design. But not maybe to learn design. I think the important thing about going to school that people underestimate is the network that you build when you are in school. So all the people that you go to class with, all the teachers that you are exposed to, all the informal learning that actually has nothing to do with design, you don't get that if you don't study design. And ultimately, when it comes to getting your first job or your second job or sometimes even your third job, the network that you've built starting from going to school is what will help enable that and will make that transition much faster, will open doors for you much more quickly. So if you skip all of that and you just want to start as a designer, maybe you're a great designer, but you don't have a network. So where would you start? Why would someone hire you? Um, how would you even know of an open position, right? So design school is very important, I think, more than anything else for the beginning of your network and for the rest of your career. Your network, which of course grows as you go through life, is what will get you your next, your third, your fourth, your fifth, 12th job, right? Or even if you want to start your own studio. I have a lot of feelings about, well, negative and positive feelings. So, first of all, I think there's a bigger question we need to be answering or asking ourselves, and that is, why do we need it in the first place? What is the point of it, right? And why? And it's an important question to ask because it requires such a huge amount of resources, meaning water to cool the database, the data systems, right, that host all of these very complicated calculations. So it's very bad for the environment. And I'm not super convinced that the amount of damage that it's doing to the planet is actually worth what we're getting from it. Um, so that's my first question is, why do we need it in the first place? I haven't seen a real valid use case for it yet, other than we can do something faster, which doesn't seem like enough of a reason to basically destroy our entire ecosystem. Um, the other question I have, and that's also a bigger question, like what kind of society do we want to live in? Um, there are a lot of things that we do as humans that, of course, require creativity and, require our imagination. And the fact that we allow private companies to basically steal that from people who have created that themselves and then package that in a very kind of watered down way, if you will, to sell it back to you in a very, I don't know, like kind of crappy version of it, right? Is that what we want? And is that what we allow our data to be used for? Nobody asked me, so I'm guessing, the billionaires that are currently in power don't care about that. I care about that. I think it's important that we think a little bit more hardly or more critically about not just intellectual property, but also just in general, like what kind of world we want to live in. Do we want to live in a world where artificial intelligence does most of it, right? I always laugh when it's like, I thought if we're going to have robots, like let them clean the house. Like, I don't want them to take away my creativity? So why are we allowing for that? It's kind of strange. Now, I have to also be realistic, and it is that we are there, whether we like it or not, right? The age of artificial intelligence is here. We're in the middle of it. And especially now, as we know, we're very close to a second version of space race, right, between China and the US, because DeepSeek was just released, and which means that ChatGPT is scared now, which means that they're just going to go more nuts with their innovation and use of funds, right? They're going to fund it even more. So we're here, it's happening, whether I like it or not. Now, I do think we need some proper guardrails around it. I think we need legislation around it. I think that legislation needs to be enforced. Um, and ultimately, you know, there are things that is really, of course, it does many great things. Like it can do all this research, it can speed everything up. There's many benefits to it. But what are we paying for in return, right? It's a little bit like a deal with the devil kind of thing. Like we're getting all these things, but we're sacrificing so much more. And I wonder if the sacrifices are worth it. Um, I think that we will be in trouble in the long run as designers. I don't think that it's realistic to think that we are immune to the advancements of artificial intelligence. And I'll give you an example. Before the record player was invented, you know, that uh, recorded music basically, there were far more working musicians in the world because you could only listen to music if it was live, you know? So being a musician was a normal job back then. You know, people would have a musician in the family and that person would be able to make a living doing that. Because if you would go to a theater show or a play or whatever, there would be a live orchestra and those people would get paid for that job, right? And then recorded music was invented and all those people were without a job. So the people that can afford to be a musician now, it's a very small percentage of the population, right? You have to be super good because there's very few places for you to exist because we don't need live musicians anymore. And I think the same will happen to design. You will have the very best, the very top, in the same way that you can only be a musician, a working musician, if you are amazing in the future, and not even that far in the future. You will only be able to be a working designer if you are amazing. And very few will be. And so the majority will be without a job. And I don't agree with that, but I do think that that's what's going to happen. I think if I were starting now, what I would focus on as a UX designer is accessibility. I think that's a very, very, very important topic. Um, right now, you have to imagine that, for example, in Europe, I don't know about Asia, but I know in Europe, it's like 22% or something are people that are born between 1946 and 1963. These are the European baby boomers, right, that were born after World War II. So these people are old. They're 60, 70, 80 years old, right? And they are dealing with all sorts of impairments. They're going blind, they're going deaf, they're having all sorts of issues, right? And it's inhibiting them from interacting with the digital world. And so we are focusing, I think, on the wrong problem, or we have focused on so many problems in the past. And I think now, if you go and become a UX designer and you just know about usability, it's like, who cares? Every UX designer knows about that. You know, you're nothing special. But if you specialize in accessibility, not only will you be able to serve like a huge audience of people that are old, and old people tend to need accessibility features, you also open the door to 1 billion people in the world who live with a disability right now, who are either blind or deaf or have motor impairments or whatever it may be. So 1 billion people are hindered from using technology right now because it's not designed for them. Um, and it's shocking because of all the digital products in the world that we have, only 4% of them are fully accessible. So these billion people and all these baby boomers that are going blind or losing their hearing, um, you know, 96% of them, of the websites and of the apps, they cannot even use. So it's a very important topic right now. And the European Union is going to introduce a new legislation in June, which is going to force private companies to be at least AA accessible. And if you're not, then you run the risk of getting fined, getting penalties, getting warnings, or in a very extreme scenario, they might prohibit you from operating in the European market in general. So this is an important topic right now. And if I were a UX designer now, I would have my eye on that. I would learn about these laws. I would learn about the reality of what it means to design accessibly, because there's going to be a lot of work, even without artificial intelligence, ruining it for us. There's still a lot of work to be done by real human beings in that space. So I would focus on that.